Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the McCarthy series. Today, we are moving through a session co-hosted between the McCarthy Institute at Golden Gate University and Keystone Strategy Consulting. The McCarthy Institute is a research institute devoted to the advancement of knowledge in trademark and advertising law and consumer perceptions around advertising. And Keystone Strategy is a national boutique consulting firm providing high-level strategy consulting in the areas of business solutions, litigation, and public policy development. Our panelists will be on shortly, but I would encourage 2 housekeeping items this morning. First of all, if you would jump into the chat feature and let us know where you're joining us from. We have registrants joining us from all over the US and beyond, so please give us a shout out, let us know where you're joining from. Also, our panelists will be moving through a live Q&A at the conclusion of presentations today. So be sure to put your questions for our panelists in the Q&A section of the Zoom feature, and our moderator will address those questions with our panelists at the appropriate time at the conclusion of presentations today. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to our moderator for today's session, Paresh Dave.
Hey, thanks, Kelsey. Appreciate you all being here. We're going to talk a little bit about, how gatekeepers, aggregators, these sort of big companies gather data on consumers and sort of how they make that accessible to everyone else and the benefits that brings for both consumers and for businesses. But of course, also a lot of unintended consequences and frustrations. And how do businesses solve that, or how do governments solve that? And help everyone effectively compete. And our 4 speakers should give us a nice view of that. And as Kelsey said, grateful for your questions. So first up today will be Ken Wilbur, professor of marketing at the University of California, San Diego, who's done a lot of research on the online advertising industry for companies and has worked with companies like Google and Procter & Gamble and many others. So please, Ken, take it away.
Thanks, Paresh. Can everybody see my screen okay? So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share a paper with you. I'm going to give part of the motivation and a little bit of the flavor of the content of the paper, and invite anybody interested to take a more careful look after the session. So the development of digital advertising for marketers has just been absolutely phenomenal. Instead of paying on TV to reach everybody in a family all at once, marketers can select which members of the family can choose individual messages to send to those people, and can even choose the days and times that they send those messages, and the frictions that have been removed from this market are just it's made the advertising function so much easier than it ever was before. And the platforms that have enabled this have been richly rewarded for their innovations. Digital advertising revenues is up about 5-fold over the past decade, and it's still growing at quite a healthy clip. As an economist, you would look at this and say, boy, these are phenomenal figures. Just enormous value must be being created. However, there is this very steady drumbeat of concern of a variety of types. As many of us know, the EU has fined Google more than $9 billion in 3 different cases, and the FTC fined Facebook $5 billion for violating a consent decree, and there are a variety of other actions that are ongoing. And in the US, one of the very few things that both major political parties agree on is their concerns about big tech. There have been a series of recent regulatory reports investigating this industry. Perhaps the most aggressive to date was in Australia, which which made a couple of dozen policy recommendations, and including establishing a specialized digital platform markets regulator. And in October of this year, the US House Subcommittee on Antitrust came out with quite an aggressive and a pessimistic view of the industry. And so we've read these reports, and from a marketing perspective, we've written this paper to highlight a couple of issues that get short shrift in some of these reports. And so first of all, from a traditional economic perspective, the goals of regulation in advertising markets are basically to maximize the value provided of the connections between consumers and producers of goods and services. And that's what the advertisements are there for, is to create those connections. And traditionally, gatekeepers, whether they be publishers or platforms, have had to subsidize consumer attention to advertising by offering goods which attract consumer attention, and then they monetize those goods by charging advertisers for bundling advertising messages along with the goods. Now, that's all understood pretty well. However, in their 25 years of existence, digital advertising markets have developed some unique challenges. And some of those are very well understood, like antitrust issues, brand safety, consumer privacy, how platforms use data. But there are four fundamental issues that we felt have not been well represented in the public discourse. And so we've tried to dive into the academic literature to review what's known, to summarize some credible knowledge from industry sources, and to propose some directions for where we need to go next as a society to better understand these issues and make sure these markets are functioning in a healthy way. So the first one, which I'm going to talk at a bit more length, is how advertisers measure ad effects, which is to say, how do advertisers evaluate the value of the advertising inventory that they're paying for? The second one is basically inefficiencies in the way the advertising procurement chain is organized. There are principal agent problems between marketers and their self-interested advertising agencies. And there are also many internal barriers, failures of coordination within marketing organizations that can distort efficient advertising decisions. The third one is a consumer technology, which many of us are familiar with, called ad blocking, where consumers can install software to passively block all or most advertisements. There's no solid figure on how prevalent ad blocking technology is, but the best range I've been able to find is that it affects between 8 and 47% of ads potentially displayed to consumers. The ad blockers themselves basically charge tolls to the ad sellers of about 30% of the ad cost. And the platforms that pay those tolls, their ads get through. This technology also harms publisher incentives to produce high quality content. And then finally, digital advertising fraud is a collection of practices which are used to misrepresent advertising inventory and disguise computers as humans. And most industry estimates find that around 10 to 30% of ad spend goes into the pockets of fraudsters. Some estimates are higher than that, others are lower. There's a lot of confusion on the issue, and part of it is the nature of identity on the internet. And historically, ad fraud has been a cat and mouse game in which fraudsters develop new technologies, and then legitimate actors find ways to detect and block those technologies, and then fraudsters innovate. And there has been some recent progress in reducing the incidence of advertising supply chain participants stealing from each other, but there hasn't been major progress on reducing the number of botnets and machines that are posing as humans in order to create non-existent advertising opportunities to steal money from advertisers and into unscrupulous publishers' hands. Now, we have some sharp time limitations. So the one thing I'm going to say about ad effect measurement is that to know what an advertising opportunity is worth to the advertiser who pays for it, you have to know two things. One, you have to know whether the consumer took the advertiser's desired action, and two, you have to know what the consumer would have done in the absence of the advertisement. And there are problems measuring both of those. Complete conversion measurement is typically not possible, and it's often not very reliable. And then the second part, we have to know what would have happened if the ad had not been served, which fundamentally is a counterfactual. There are ways to estimate group level effects, such as running experiments. However, we have some very credible recent literature showing a variety of things. Number one, advertisers very seldom run experiments. Number two, when they do run experiments, the experiments typically are inconclusive. And the reason for that is that ads tend to have fairly subtle effects that occur in very noisy environments. And then number three, unfortunately, non-experimental methods typically do quite a poor job of recovering accurate advertising effects. And so, you add this up and you have purchasers in digital advertising markets who are not able to evaluate the value of the services, the advertising inventory that they're buying. And economists have a term for that type of market. It's called a credence good, where you have to believe in the value of what you're buying without being able to assess it for yourself. And my favorite example of a credence good is life insurance. I pay my premium every year. I hope it will pay out to my family in the event of my untimely death, but I will never know whether that happened because I won't be here anymore. Usually these types of markets are intermediated by regulators or provided by nonprofits, and typically these are very competitive industries, and so digital advertising markets are not there yet, but there may be a good basis to create welfare maximizing regulations. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ken. Fascinating to hear that advertisers actually don't do that many experiments. And next up is Professor Anja Lambrecht, who is a professor of marketing at the London Business School. And she's, taking a look at, how to advertise on Twitter, and recently taking a look at things like algorithmic bias in advertising. And she's going to tell us a little bit about data and how advertisers make use of it, or in companies in general make use of it, which I think should fit well with where Ken left off there. Anja, take it away.
Can you see I assume if I don't hear from you, you can see my presentation now. Is that right?
Looks good. Yes.
Okay, good. Very good. So yes, I'll talk briefly about competition, big data, and innovation. And so what is driving this? It's the general discussion that big data might be able to confer firms a competitive advantage. Well, let's start with the question, what actually is big data? So typically three characteristics that are being discussed are the high volume of data, high variety, so different types of data, and high velocity, so new data accumulating at high speeds. And so the main point I'm going to make is that big data as such, and only big data, is actually quite unlikely to lead to a sustainable competitive advantage for firms. And why is that? Well, the key message, and just to be clear about one thing here, is that I'm not saying that big data is not a managerial advantage. Clearly, data can be useful for firms. Instead, what I argue is that the big data, actually what's more important is the main constraint on managerial capacity, and that is labor supply. Supply of individuals who are very knowledgeable in terms of how to handle and interpret the data. And so ultimately, what this means is that big data by itself is probably not sufficient to create a sustainable competitive advantage. And I think this is very important because it changes the view on, it should change the managerial discussion about the role of data in firms and what other competencies would be required. Now, the way I look at this is through a framework, criteria that have been very established in the strategy literature. And they ask essentially that, well, is a resource, any type of resource, does any type of resource confer a sustainable competitive advantage? Well, this depends, is the case if the resource is inimitable, if it is rare, valuable, as well as non-substitutable. Now let's go through this and see whether this applies to these different criteria applied to big data. Well, first of all, is big data inimitable? You know, as you know, once you start browsing the web, you leave digital footprints everywhere. And in many instances, different types of firms actually collect similar pieces of information about your digital life. Different sources of tracking come actually about to similar conclusion, what type of interests you are, what type of needs you have as a consumer. And at the same time, we also know that there is a market for data, right? Credit card companies are just one type of firm that constantly offer data for sale, thus allowing other firms to get a better idea of who you are as a consumer. Next question, is big data rare? Well, one type of restrictions that used to be in place, say maybe 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, is storage. Data storage used to be incredibly costly and difficult. However, it's obvious that data storage has become a pretty much commonplace, and the cost of storing data has decreased significantly, thus not really presenting a competitive barrier. At the same time, we come back to the digital footprint. Well, if big data is available in many different forms at different sources, in many instances, then the big data, the information contained as such, would not be rare and would not necessarily confer at the firm a sustainable competitive advantage. Let's go to this question of big data as valuable. And, you know, I think that the main point is that big data in many ways holds this promise of developing a better relationship with customers. And you could think about customized information, about better targeting of online advertising. However, the point to keep in mind is, first of all, again, talent is hugely important. What I'm showing you here is the data in AI landscape, and that's as of last year, so it's probably gotten a lot more complex since. And it becomes pretty clear we are talking about a universe that's exploded in the number of players, in the number of specializations, and therefore also in the number of parties and firms who wish to hire the appropriate talent, who wish to hire data scientists. And what we see nowadays is actually talent and managerial knowledge is a huge bottleneck, not necessarily the access to data. The next question then, how large are actually the gains from having more data? So here we speak about, you know, assume you have some volume of data. Well, if you start adding more and more data points, how much more do you learn? You know, let's look at volume, which is just merely the question of adding more data points. It turns out that having larger volumes can possibly mislead. So, you know, there are cases where a certain amount of data as such is already, you know, useful for a firm, provided they know how to analyze it and draw the appropriate managerial conclusions. And adding more data may actually not improve insights significantly. At the same time, you know, as I said earlier, one other component of big data is variety. Well, handling a variety of data, as many marketers in the audience here and will know, is actually not straightforward. You know, we talk about potentially merging video data and different type of text data and image data. But if we could take an even simpler approach, I've worked with firms where already the question of merging web browsing data and purchase data is actually not straightforward. So handling a variety of data can be challenging and does not necessarily, especially easily, lead to large gains. Then we speak about velocity, right? So how much does actually increased velocity contribute to the value of data? And again, here, having data updated in real time does not always actually improve the type of recommendations you would make to consumers, the type of targeting of ads. That doesn't mean that any velocity is useless. There are instances where it's valuable for firms, but again, it's conditional on actually being able to interpret that. Now here I'm coming to another point that is really important, and that actually relates nicely to Ken's point earlier. So you might recall that Ken just made that point about how hard it can be to measure advertising effectiveness. Well, so ultimately, as a marketer, we always want to see what's the effect of X on Y, what's the effect of throwing advertising before Christmas on sales. And as we all know, for good reasons, marketers, firms advertise a whole lot more before Christmas. And of course, they also sell a whole lot more. That's why they advertise more. But how do we actually know that this increased level of advertising actually led to the outcome, led to an increased level of sales? And so the challenge of big data and associated technologies such as machine learning, which is often cited in one breath with big data, is that we observe correlations. And you put in more data and you'll have more correlations and they'll become more and more significant. But as such, that does not tell you much about the actual impact of X on Y. It gives you a correlation, but not necessarily causal inference. And so to make proper causal inferences, again, we need the talent. And at the same time, we need to be able to conduct field experiments, A/B tests, where we vary one element and can look at the outcome of others. So what I'm arguing is to actually have a valuable outcome, talent and the ability to draw causal inference is absolutely necessary. Now we come to that last part, is big data non-substitutable? And, you know, the idea underlying this assumption is, well, you know, unless you have big data, would you actually be able to run a business as you do? Do you actually need those data? Well, we said before that you might be able to substitute different data sets by just purchasing them. But let's have a look at innovation. Well, if you look at innovation, it actually turns out that many firms did a fantastic job in innovating without any data. So let's look at WhatsApp. Having access to big data didn't help telcos. WhatsApp still entered the market and, as we know, has become an incredibly popular messaging tool, substituting certainly for text messages and probably also for calls, so eating into the market of telcos. Well, it didn't help traditional gaming companies. If you think about gaming companies, these are data-driven companies. They can analyze to what extent tweaking games will actually increase user engagement. When Fortnite launched, and you know, if you have any children in the teens or even below 10, you will know very well how addictive Fortnite can be. Fortnite didn't have much data. Think back 5-10 years, Candy Crush. You know, Candy Crush was incredibly attractive for many users. That was not based on the access to data when Candy Crush launched. Airbnb, very similar. Didn't help hotel chains to know their customers. And I know we are coming close to running out of time, so I'll wrap this up quickly. But if you think about the market for online dating, there were many different online platforms. Tinder launched out of nowhere, and Tinder grabbed huge market shares within a relatively short time period. Why? Because Tinder was able to better understand customer needs. Customer needs in terms of how consumers wanted to interact with online dating platforms. For example, women did not like to be contacted by so very many men. Men did not like to be constantly rejected. And Tinder created an interface that better met the needs in the way that consumers wanted to interact. So the punchline here is big data by itself is probably not enough to create a sustainable competitive advantage. The rare resources are useful analytics, talent, and customer insights. And that means in a way we are back to marketing 101. We need to understand customer needs. Tinder did a great job understanding customer needs. So did WhatsApp and Airbnb. Or if you want to talk about more recent direct consumer models in the actual product space, think about firms like Casper Sleep that launched a mattress in the box to target a small segment initially of consumers who did not want to go into mattress shops, but now expanded into mattress shops and offering a much better customer experience than mattress companies did 10 years ago. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Anja. So we've now heard sort of that theoretical view of some of the pitfalls to be aware of and the labor necessary, the talent necessary to take them on and experiment. Next up, we have Sachin, the VP of Growth Marketing at McAfee, to sort of give us a practitioner's view and tell us how it works on the ground level as someone who has the talent to tackle the big data.
Thank you, Paresh. Hello, everyone. Before we jump in, let's play a quick role.
What does security mean to you? To some, it means a hug. It's cuddling in a pillow fort. Security is a feeling, an emotion, a sense of belonging and place, free from worry. And it's a feeling you should have in everything your family does. Whether that's letting kids play on tablets without worrying about inappropriate ads, or protecting teens from online dangers. Experience security everywhere with McAfee Total Protection.
Thank you. Good to be here. Why I presented that, let's go to the next slide, is I'm going to talk about consumer marketing and how different element plays in. And it all starts with consumer. End of the day, the goal of a marketer or business is to serve consumer the value either through product, through messaging, personalization, what have you. The goal is eventually to serve and serve for the consumer. And that's what marketers try to do. They try to tell stories that rhyme with consumers, whether it is saving the world, inspiring, or even saying sorry at times. It's all about stories for marketers, and that jives with customers and consumers out there. If you go to the next slide, and these stories need to matter. And there are a variety of different KPIs that we marketers, CMOs, CDOs, we all try to measure, whether it is customer metrics like engagement, things like whether they are repeating, whether they're installing your product, whether they are active, are they sharing, are they talking about your product, do they like your product, or they're liking it, they're recommending it, and or the KPIs that matter from investor standpoint or finance standpoint, whether it is ROI. All these things matter quite a lot, and this is what drives the stories that marketers tell. But end of the day, it all gets boiled down to what stories you want to tell to the consumers that ride with them. So I'll come back to this topic again, but let's move forward and look at some of these examples as we thought about it from McAfee, and which is where I played the video. We have been on this journey where we recognized a couple of years ago that security and safety is not just about the device that we have. We all use gazillion devices, IoTs in our house, and it has evolved from purely being protecting the device to being personal protection, protecting yourself, your family, your household. And in this year's pandemic, it has become even more pronounced as we are spending more time online, pretty much doing everything online. This is all about saving yourself, protecting yourself, being free in the way that jives with you. And being able to connect to that is where we ran this campaign of what does security mean to you, because it means different to different people. As a father, I'm more worried about my daughter attending the classes in the next room and she's not been exposed to the content she should be. There are people who are meeting their doctors, and they should have the privacy is the right, and they should be able to meet their doctors privately. There are people who are working flexibly from anywhere, whether it's a coffee shop or home taking care of their kids. They should be able to connect to internet safely. And it's this connect which is very, very important. And our data has showed that when you go and tell customers the stories that jive with them, creates value and it's helpful. Helpful is the key word. They engage, they find it valuable, and at some point they may choose to choose your franchise to be part of it. So that's basically the way many marketers approach. That's the way we approached it, and it has to need to connect back to the story that matters and stories that drive business and the outcomes from consumer standpoint. So if we go to the next slide, what is direct to consumer all about? And as we have experienced from our journey from purely a B2B2C to B2C to a direct to consumer company and evolving through that, a lot of this comes down to eventually relationships. The relationship and trust that you inculcate to the customers or potential customers who engage with you. And you do that through series of helpful experiences and storytelling. And story is a beautiful way of connecting to the experience. There's no better way to capture the emotion on this image than the story of this family trying to have a good time together. So that relationship is critical, and it is not transactional. And a lot of effort towards direct to consumer is evolving towards that. So let's look at some examples of that. If you go to the next slide, I try to capture what those examples could be. It doesn't need to be from where I come from. I choose to showcase the one that I can talk straight from what we have done in the last couple quarters. So as the new pandemic, as this year's pandemic, we recognize a lot of people are spending time home, and we invested very heavily in building content and educating our customers about how to add value and be helpful in their life. For example, there are parents who are trying to homeschool their kids. So we develop content around how to keep little ones safe. What are the different resources for homeschooling, classes online? A lot of our friends, they lost job this year. We have seen unprecedented unemployment rates. So we develop content around how do you ace interviews, video interviews? What kind of technology do you use? What camera you should think about the sound? How do you show up? A lot of people are attending and meeting their doctors online. So how to keep you safe? There are a variety of different use cases where we realize it's all about people need help, and they will find these quick, helpful tip resources valuable and helpful, much broader than just the product we offer. And that was the critical point with which we invested a lot of resources towards educating the customers and being helpful to be out there. And this is where I feel direct to consumer and the relationship and trust comes to fruition when it comes to direct to consumer marketing. And we have seen some great results, good feedback coming in from the customer. And I would highly encourage other marketers to endeavor and try to be helpful out there. Consumers need help. This is the time to help. This is where we can serve our community. And it does generate business value as well. At least from our experience, we can say that. So if we go to the next slide, how do you approach this? You have to, I talked about it, you got to tell a story, but it has to matter. And it matters when you connect your customer life cycle to the KPIs. You create KPIs that you can measure, and these are embedded into customers. These are three simple ones that I track on a very often basis. Like, what's our customer growth? Our customers liking what they are seeing with us, and they choose by voting. They choose. They tell you whether they like what you're doing is by selecting your franchise or your product, your services, whatever you're offering. Customer acquisition cost optimization, customer lifetime value enhancement. Like, are they just transacting with you, or they're choosing to stay with you for a long time and repeatedly, whether it is monthly or annual? And these are the metrics that are embedded in customer and forces marketers to start thinking and start from consumer to build outside in perspective, but it also connects an inside out view of connecting it back to the financial KPIs that matter. I know Anja talked about this, and Ken mentioned this too. End of the day, it really comes down to being able to measure the impact and measure it in an incremental way that adds meaningful value from financial standpoint, but also to the customer. And in my experience, having done this for more than a decade, is you have to connect the KPIs back to the stories you're telling. And if you want to drive the customer satisfaction, you want to drive the customer story, you have to connect your KPIs back to that. So let's go to the next slide. It gets a little bit more tactical in nature, but I felt that it is important to leave behind what are the pillars and how you may want to think as a marketer for direct-to-consumer marketing. Very simply, there are 4 key pillars where it comes down to audience insights, whether it is big data, small data, analytics, machine learning, incrementality, whatever that is, like develop those personas and segments to understand your customers. What is that human truth? For example, as a parent, I'm struggling to make sure my kid's education and learning is happening appropriately this year. Human truth and how you can connect to that is important, and tell that story, connect and be helpful in that aspect. How do you be that? Is by creating content and creative, which aligns with that particular customer and they find it relevant. And choosing the right platforms and market to deliver it, whether it is your own platform, whether it is earned media like social, or it could be paid advertising or paid medias to reach out to these customers, and connecting at the moment of truth where it matters. And the last very, very important is data and how you measure, because what you measure is what you do. And this is where it connects the secret sauce of what is working, what is not is working, what you learn from it, how do you do more, how can you optimize further, and it connects very nicely across all those 4 pillars. And end of the day, as a marketer, what I've learned is the platform's evolution, human truth, human relevance, they evolve. The behavior evolves, new platform comes. So rapidly experiment across the board. I have a few papers that I published on this as well, which you can look up. But to me, it comes down to the secret sauce. And I know Anja nailed it right on the head there. It all comes down to talent and culture. And it is important to kind of address that and keep that as a differentiating point when it comes to it. With that comes to my close of my time, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Sachin. So next up, we have Professors David Hyman and David Franklyn. David Hyman of Georgetown Law and David Franklyn of Golden Gate University are our sponsor today. And they've spent a bunch of years looking at Google Shopping and the EU and some remedies and how Google has changed their product over the years. And they're going to give you a sneak preview of some upcoming research.
Thank you, Paresh. I'm David Franklyn, and we're really delighted to have all of you here, both speakers and our audience. So I want to switch gears a little bit, David Hyman and I do, and think about consumer welfare in the context of potential regulation of advertising online. We've seen from the previous speakers a explosion of digital advertising and digital marketing in the last 20 years. And certainly leading in many ways, this explosion has been Google. It is not the only online platform that plays a significant role in, if you will, merging or combining search features with advertising. But it is, I think, one can think, for example, of Amazon as being a place where people start product searches, and therefore search is an intrinsic and important component of Amazon, as is, they have other things they do, like deliver products to your door. Google, however, plays this incredibly important role in providing information and about products or services that consumers in the United States and indeed around the world may be looking for. And I think it's fairly well known by now that, and so what I want to do here a little bit in the time that I have of our segment is set this up, introduce this, contextualize it, talk about our motivation, talk about some of our first starting place with our research, and then hand it off to David Hyman to tell you where we're at in the paper that and the research that we're conducting now. So Google started out, I suppose, about 20 years ago, primarily as a search engine and not as an advertising vehicle. And it prided itself on providing almost exclusively, if not exclusively, what we might call organic search results, meaning you looked for a product, and based on their algorithm, which was and continues to be, or algorithms guided by trade secrets, you found a list of search results. Increasingly over the last 20 years, Google has, while continuing to provide so-called organic search results, has provided advertisements. Some of these advertisements over the years, they've morphed in terms of how they're labeled and how they appear on Google results pages. David Hyman and I have called that, for lack of creativity, labeling and architecture of the page, of the Google search results landing page, primarily focusing on the first page, because that's where most people start and stop with their searches. But as that's happened, we discovered in some of our early research that significant numbers of searchers on Google could not accurately tell the difference between paid and unpaid search results. And that seemed to us to present possibly a problem in terms of consumer welfare and consumer protection. We continue to conduct and publish research along those lines. And about 7 years ago, we were retained by a consortium of companies in Europe called fairsearch.org to conduct research that ended up moving into testing some of Google's proposed settlements with the European Commission, which was looking at regulating Google search results and advertising, in this instance, in one particular area. And the area has to do with what might be called specialized or search areas. So you might think about Google product searches, which are often called Google Shopping, or used to be. You might think about Google Hotel search services, Google Maps, and other areas where Google has developed specialized search. And the argument was made in the European Commission that Google was leveraging its monopoly or its power over general search to favor itself in areas of specialized search, to the detriment of competitors in specialized search, and to the detriment ultimately, allegedly, of consumers who were not being well served, according to this argument, by this this kind of Google dominance. And so I read here from portions of the preliminary conclusions of the European Commission regarding this particular area of Google behavior. And I'm just going to skip down to the second bullet point and highlight a few of these findings, and then move on to how what the EC did about this at the bottom of this page, and then how this prompted years later David Hyman and I to go back and revisit this research. I should say we testified before the European Commission in 2013 or 14, before the European Commission entered its statement of objections in this matter, which is a kind of formal charge against an entity with penalties and with orders. So the second bullet point says Google does not apply its own comparison shopping service or to it, its own system of penalties, which it applies to other comparison shopping services on the basis of defined parameters, and which can lead to the lowering of the rank in which they, that is the non-Google related shopping comparison sites, appear in Google's general search results pages. And then they give the example of Frugal, probably some of which you've not heard of, maybe some of you, unless you're tuning in from Europe and have a memory of this. Google's first comparison shopping service did not benefit from any favorable treatment and performed poorly. As a result, Google favored its subsequent comparison shopping services, and favoring meaning lifting them higher up on the landing page than they might have occurred by consequence solely of the application neutrally of the algorithm. And so you find Google product search, Google shopping experience hiring rates of appearance and growth according to the EC, to the detriment of rival comparison shopping services. I might note that some of the rival comparison shopping services you will see here mentioned in our findings in Europe, we do not really see, or we don't see anywhere near the same degree in the United States, because there hasn't been regulation, there hasn't been the same kind of focus on this, or maybe there just hasn't been a market for it. Hard for us to determine that, given this these historical developments. So Google conduct, according to the EC, has had a negative impact on consumers and innovation. It means users do not see the most relevant comparison shopping results in response to their query. And then at the bottom, in the statement of objections, it takes the preliminary view that in order to remedy this, Google must treat its own comparison shopping services and those of rivals in the same way. And then at the bottom, it says it would mean that Google shows comparison shopping services in response to a user's query, the most relevant service or services according to an algorithm and not according to just favorable treatment by Google. Now, the mechanics of how Google would go about complying with this, if you will, behind the scenes is another matter and somewhat technical. But here is a screenshot of Google Shopping results in Europe before the SO that we just read from was enacted. And David, Hyman, and I had captured these results many years ago. And so you see shop for Nikon camera on Google. If you see a bunch of Nikon cameras, you see places at the bottom in green where you can buy them, like stores like Target or Best Buy, but you don't see what might be called an aggregator of this kind of information mentioned. Similarly, to the right, shop for London fog on Google, you see Macy's, you see Overstock, and you see prices. So if we could go to the next slide, please. You see Google Shopping Post-S.O, Europe only. We are conducting searches using McCarthy Institute fellows who are laboriously conducting hundreds of searches in 3 European countries and capturing the screen results, and then we're coding them to try to develop a statistical profile of the prevalence now of rivals, and whether, at least in this respect, it would appear that Google is, quote unquote, complying with the statement of objections in the order to give equal treatment to price comparison websites. Now, we did find, as you see here, like in a search for Stella Artois beer, at the bottom of this one on the top left, you see by product caster. I believe that's an aggregator or price comparison site. Over to the right for Kronenberg beer, we try to pick, using a systematic method, brands that would be popular in particular product categories in particular European countries. And here you see by feed price, you see by Google, you see by feed price again. And on the bottom left set, you see a whole bunch of responses to search queries for Keef's moisturizer by Google, by Google, by Google, by Google. And then for beer, you see by Google, by feed price, and by feed price. So we see a lot more prevalence or presence of rival aggregators. With that, I'm going to turn over the microphone, as it were, to Professor David Hyman at Georgetown and ask him to finish our presentation.
Thank you, David. Can I get the next slide? So just quickly, because we're running long, the obvious question is how should we measure compliance? And we've sketched out some possibilities here. We focused on the last possibility, which is visibility. How often do rival shopping services appear in the Google shopping region? Next slide, please. And so we did searches in 3 countries for 12 popular consumer products per country, 5 brands per product. We picked popular brands in each country, so we weren't doing the same searches everywhere. Both desktop and mobile, 2 rounds of data collection. We ended up with a total of 706 total SRPs collected. Next slide, please. And we then coded those SRPs as to whether there was a Google shopping region, which entities appeared in the region, consistent with the examples David just talked about, and then computed the share of slots in the shopping regions overall accounted for by Google and all of the rivals. Next slide, please. So overall, we see SRPs that have shopping in 19% of our sample, total of 132. Similar percentages in France and Germany, much lower in UK. We're still investigating that. But if you look at the share of those 132 that are Google only versus rivals only versus Google plus rivals, you see the overwhelming majority of shopping regions have both Google and rivals in the same shopping region. Much smaller but similar numbers have either Google only links or rivals only links. Last slide, please. Next to last slide. Next slide. If you look at the share of the slots rather than the makeup of the 132 shopping region examples we study, here we've got a total of 575 ads. Google accounts for just under 50%, and the all rivals collectively account for just over 50%. And you can see the relative market share of each of the listed entities. The largest 2 are Kelku and Feed Price, which you saw examples of Feed Price previously. So at one level, this indicates that the Google's compliance with the SO has resulted in a significant change of visibility for CSS's competing shopping services. Next slide, please. And so, you know, a bunch of questions that we can talk about. Does this response actually comply with the shopping decision, that is, including the rivals in Google shopping region rather than allowing them to have their own shopping region? There are obvious questions about representativeness and the comparability of our findings across countries. And we've got a bunch of areas of future research that you can see spelled out here. The last of which I want to flag the other verticals question. We focus only on Google Shopping, as did the EC's statement of objections. And so it's an interesting question whether we see similar patterns in the other verticals. And so last slide, I think, was that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, both Davids. So we have about 20 minutes for questions, and would love to hear any that you have. Please add them to the Q&A section. But I'll jump in the meantime. So Ken, one thing that you didn't go into deeply is sort of identity. The hot topic right now in sort of the marketing world, as I understand it, is how do you, understand who the consumer that you're talking to is? As cookies go away, as it becomes harder because of privacy changes on mobile to understand who the unique consumer is. What's your sort of proposal or pathway to sort of fix the identity crisis in advertising? And does it matter for when you're measuring the ad effect and those experiments that you want to run? Do you really need to know the consumer?
That's a great question, Paresh. My advice to brands recently has been, we have no idea what consumer privacy regulations will be in place in what jurisdictions 5 years from now. We don't know if the platforms are going to stick to their announced changes of deleting or modifying cookies, or what might be offered in their place. What I've been recommending is to move away from individual consumer identities and instead create tracking panels of small areas such as zip codes or IP addresses, where brands can measure the coincidence of the amount that they spend on advertising, as well as their returns, such as sales or web visits or other indicators of positive response to ads. And the reason for that recommendation is that the digital platforms all enable micro targeting of areas. And I don't believe that will be going away. And so brands could invest in that new type of structure and expect it to remain viable for the long term.
And Anja, you were saying that, to sort of make those micro targeting decisions, know who, how to shape marketing campaigns, the companies need labor, they need talent. And so how does a traditional hotel company, a traditional telco company, how do they compete for that talent? Because the Airbnbs, the WhatsApp, they're cool places to work. That's where people are going. So I guess fundamental to the point that you're making is, like, how do these companies start to compete for the talent, assuming that they have the right data already?
Well, I think in a way, you can't start with a question with how do I hire a data scientist, right? The question is, how do I put in place a structure where a data science is valued and feeds into managerial decision making? And in a way, this starts at the top, right? So you need management that prioritizes these type of decisions, that frankly understands how to make decisions based on data. And many firms, in a way, we tend to look at, we think digital firm and we think Google, but Google or Facebook are not the full universe of digital firms, and there are many firms which function in much more traditional ways, and still, try to use the digital platform in some way. And the key point is trying to understand making decisions not based on maybe correlational evidence, maybe not based on gut feeling, by putting in place a decision-making structure that actually values these types of insights. It starts with setting aside resources for experimental structures, right? If you come to a firm and say, I'd like to run an A/B test, and say, oh yeah, we do have a pipeline, probably we can accommodate you in 6 weeks. That's not at all unusual, right? So let's be clear. You have firms like Booking.com that runs thousands of millions of A/B tests in a year. But many firms, some firms are just limited by the availability of data. Booking just happens to be very large firms, which makes it easier. But other firms also don't have the platforms that allow them to swiftly implement new tests. A platform that also has a reporting structure, right? So if you implement a test, you have to be able to see ad hoc where the experiment is going, have the reporting structure. So I think the question is not, let's go out and hire the right people, because the right people will not be able to work and they will not be happy and value for their money in an environment that's not set up. It starts with setting up the, Sachin earlier talked about the culture, setting up the internal managerial infrastructure to get this done.
Right. And going to you, Sachin. So it sounds like you do have some of these structures and systems in place. And you were mentioning that audience insights basically fuel your story. How are you getting those insights? Can you walk us through that a little bit more? Where do you gather these insights to fuel your stories? And then 2, you said sort of rapidly experiment. What is rapid? What is the right timeline? How fast are we talking about?
Yep, great question. And I'm going to piggyback on what Anja said and provide more practical perspective on this. So first, experiment is not something that, at least for last 6 to 7 years, is not something that we run as a side thing. Hey, by the way, we need to run experiment. It has to be always on, embedded into your core marketing, go-to-market strategy. And the way we run experiments is we always base it into an audience hypothesis, a customer behavior hypothesis. Now that hypothesis could be convert, that hypothesis could be engage, leave a comment, visit, whatever that you, but we start with that hypothesis and then we run it as an always on, fed into the financial KPIs. So the financial forecast that we bake in, and I've been doing this for many, many years, they bake into what level of experiments we do. I use a very simple framework to talk about the speed that you talk is how many experiments you run, what is the win rate, and what is an average lift from each of these experiments. When you look at this funnel, it can tell you if we need to generate 100, 200, $1 billion, or $50 million, you can actually back calculate what level of experimentation velocity, picking Anja's word, I love that framework, picking up that velocity. And then for that velocity, how many different types of tests you have to perform and what resources do you do? So in my team, I've always had a dedicated team focusing on test and learn with very specific accountability to business outcome. But those business outcomes are driven into customer behavior change. Now back to your first question, which is like, how do you generate these insights? And these insights are not generated by a separate analytics team or data science team, which is doing their magic and coming back and saying, hey, this is what customer behavior is. This is an ongoing activity. So within my team itself, we have data scientists, behavioral marketers, and analysts embedded into these Scrum teams, into these teams who are running experiments, who are constantly developing these hypotheses and testing them through incrementality and other tests that we perform. In addition to that, the type of people that we have hired are curious. And those, they will have a hypothesis, they'll go into the data and they'll try to generate those insights, whether it is through segmentation. We have generated all kinds of segmentations through cluster or K-mean and other methodologies that exist to decipher out these insights. But it really comes down to the culture of being curious, testing it, doing it always on, and most importantly, connecting it back to the financial outcome, because that's when you get funded, that's when you can build the team, that's when you can drive an always on experimentation. I know Anja talked about travel industry booking. I was with StubHub, live entertainment, very similar, rapid, fast-paced e-commerce marketplace, and you just have to run experiment. That's the way of life.
And a couple more for you. So taking one question from the audience from Yang, who was mentioning that that Ken said digital advertising is a credence good, and advertisers can't discipline the suppliers. So how does someone like yourself, how do you go about disciplining the suppliers? How do you get some edge in the market? I believe is where that question is headed. And then two, from my end, especially for your company where privacy and security is so core to what you're offering, how do you balance sort of that privacy with the consumers that you're marketing to? And are there some creepy tactics that you basically swear off and say that is just not what we're going to touch given what our brand identity is?
That's a great question, Paresh, and I would definitely address the last one to the second question, but let me address the first one. First and foremost, and I think Ken mentioned this, as a practitioner, it is tough when there is ad fraud or anything of those things that are happening, and it is difficult to track the customer. The variety of ways in which we kind of address this is, and I've been doing since 2013 or even before, there are technologies like ad verification platforms, companies like Double Verify, Integral AdSense, and others. They offer and these are the folks who they have background into digital governance and digital investigation, and they have built tools that allow you to detect where the ad frauds are happening. These are third-party tools that I've been using for many years that help us, hey, this is a fraudulent impression, or this is not a fraudulent impression. This is a robot or this is a non-brand safe environment. So it avoids you to not deliver impressions and pay for impressions which are not real or not human or bots or outside of the geography or where you don't want. So those things help a lot, and they help. And there's a lot of ad wastage that I personally have avoided using these tools. The second is back to the point that I was making earlier, is about doing tests. There are a lot of platforms that come in. There are more than 2,000 companies, and maybe more have cropped in last 1 week in marketing and ad tech. And they're all coming up with solutions and data. So understand how they're collecting the data. What is the user that is coming in? Is user giving that data or information with a value exchange or not? Are they privacy compliant? What privacy policies are they using to make sure that the data that they're selling to advertisers are correct or not? And once you assess that, run experiments to see if that platform is delivering the promised benefits that they are talking about. And the second piece is, which we always do, is run an incrementality test. Don't just always run the simple ROAS, return on ad spend within the platform. Run incrementality, A/B test, ABC test, but those incrementality tests are good and very, very important. Some platforms will not allow you. Some platforms will not allow third party to do ad verification on their platform. Many platforms don't allow that. There are many platforms that don't allow outside incrementality tests. So it's a challenge. This is where my appeal, and I've been talking about since 2019 beginning, is we need an industry body, an industry consortium to be able to manage user identity, which is exchanged and democratized by what consumer is ready to give for the value exchange of their identity. And this can be used by all platforms, all marketers, for the right exchange of value and with the right user permission. Right now, those solutions are done in silos, and silos are not good for industry or for anybody, except for silos probably. Now back to your second question of how do we manage? Listen, it's very simple. Customers, consumer trust us to help them with the privacy, identity, and data protection. There is absolutely very strict guardrails that we have baked into. We have legal privacy teams who are embedded within our team, who are constantly evaluating how we are using the data. Most importantly, the absolute no-no that you mentioned, Paresh, we do not sell data. As a part of CCPA Act, is a very clear distinction of if you sell the data, you mention it. We don't sell the data. We don't engage in that. We don't engage with technology companies or data platforms who come and commingle and try to sell our data one way or the other. And that's how we approach. And I think that's the point of view we have taken. Other advertisers, like for example, e-commerce companies, they're not in our space, and they could take a different view. My only call to action is whatever you do, be compliant with the law and be clear to the customer whether they're opting in or not when you're using their information, and do a very thorough judgment call. At least ask a question of anybody who's bringing the data. What is your privacy policy? How are you collecting this data? Do you have a very defined opt-in or not? Having said that, it's a game of whack-a-mole, but you just have to be very vigilant and privacy aware.
Okay. So the two Davids, as you know, the EU and other jurisdictions are looking at trying to regulate this space even further. The internet economy, and oftentimes the conversation has gone to how to help other businesses effectively compete, but sometimes lost in that conversation is the point that you mentioned of consumer welfare. Aggregators sometimes help consumers get the best prices, like in the case of something like Google Shopping, if it works effectively. So how should some of these conversations better be or be more inclusive of sort of this idea of consumer welfare and what is best for consumers, and not just how to help companies, other businesses effectively compete in the online economy?
Well, that's a great question, Paresh. I'll take a first crack at it and then hand the baton over to David Hyman. We have been thinking about that a lot in terms of our research right now and what our research shows and doesn't show, or may show. Visibility of rivals, which appears to be the principal focus of the order, the SO, and of Google's change in presentation of results, doesn't necessarily mean that consumers are being better served. It means they have more choices to click on, but we don't know, for example, if any of these rivals are doing better jobs at aggregating product information and pricing information and presenting equal quality of products at lower prices, as it were, to consumers than Google's doing or would be doing. And so we don't know if Google's being forced to share real estate, if you will, with other builders and vendors is actually helping anybody. And our research, however, and the whole project begs that question. We are going to be thinking about and are thinking about how to dig deeper into that. And David has thoughts on that. And I would turn it over to him to explain how we go from here to there.
Oh, great. I get the empirical question. Well, before I do the empirical question, let me just flag, something that's implicit in Paresh's question and David's response, which is a lot depends on what your theory is of what you're trying to do, right? So the pre-Chicago view of the role of the antitrust law is quite different than the Chicago view, and there are differences between the classic Chicago view and the post-Chicago view. And so, the extent to which you're protecting small businesses because you think they're a source of innovation and employment and civic virtue is rather different than we want to solve the matching problem of maximizing consumer welfare. And so, different people will have submerged or undisclosed differences in their preferences along those dimensions, and that may cash out differently in what they think they're trying to accomplish with something like the SO. In terms of examining maximizing consumer welfare, we'd have to do a quite different study than the one that we did. As the initial framing indicated, we were focusing on visibility, and neither CSS success or profitability directly get at the consumer welfare question, which would probably require something more like some of our earlier studies that looked at what are consumers' actual preferences in terms of what they're looking for when they do these searches, and to what extent does architecture and labeling steer them consistent with their preferences or steer them in a different dimension. So I think you'd have to stay tuned. We're going to have to throw another army of McCarthy Institute fellows at a follow-up study to address Paresh's question.
I would add only, and we're running out of time, that it is generally accepted, I think, that it's in the consumer and public interest for there to be transparency, for there to be choice, and for there to be informed choice. And so to the extent that Google's change of behavior in Europe promotes those things, one can begin to infer that there is an increase in consumer welfare.
Great, thanks both. And Ken, there's two questions for you in the Q&A that maybe you can get back to by typing, since we're out of time. But I'll hand it over to back to Kelsey.
Alternatively, if Ken wants to answer them, we've gone over where people are free to peel off if they want, but I don't think they will, knowing that Ken is about to answer the question.
Well, then I'll ask them. So one of them was, why don't firms experiment? What's going on there? And then two, if ad fraud is effectively, in some cases, competitors trying to undermine each other, can that amount to stealing, I guess, in the sense of the law?
So the ad fraud question is a little bit easier, and just building on something Sachin said, I agree with Sachin that it's very important for advertisers to use third-party verification firms, and many advertisers will be able to catch and reverse many detectable instances of ad fraud. At the same time, I promise you that as long as botnets exist, I could design ad fraud committing algorithms that the best available ad fraud detection firm will not be able to catch. And so these have to be understood as important, but incomplete solutions to the issue. And as to whether this is stealing, that's a tough one, because the idea of theft in digital environments, historically, the ad sales contracts didn't actually guarantee that the ads would be delivered to humans. They didn't even guarantee that the ads would be visible to humans. Visibility has been addressed a few years ago, but the contractual matters, I think I have to leave to our legal colleagues. In terms of why advertisers don't run more experiments, it's really a mixture of things, and probably the single most important is the way that firms are organized, where historically in most firms, and there are some important exceptions to this, the marketing team gets a budget from the finance team, and the finance team asks the marketing team for indications of the return on that budget. And if the marketing team shows less than stellar returns, that budget tends to shrink. And then the marketing team goes to the external advertising agencies, who often are compensated as a function of expenditure, and asks those agencies for help in proving the effectiveness of the spend. And so, when your paycheck depends on the outcome of a study, the way you design that study is probably influenced by that. And we usually find much larger advertising effects when we run correlational observational analyses like marketing mix models and multi-touch attribution algorithms. And so to really start to correct the problem, first we have to fix the measurement. Second, we have to fix the culture and get the right talent. And third, we have to fix the internal incentives. And it's really a difficult task that some performance marketers have done a good job of addressing. But when you're focused on something less measurable, like brand advertising, this is not so easy.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you to all our panelists. Just want to note that the recording of this this discussion will be available online in a few places, and the slide presentations from all the panelists will be available. So please get in touch if you're interested in those. And thanks to our sponsors, McCarthy Institute and Keystone for convening us all. And David, if there's anything you want to add, please do so. But thanks for having me.
I would thank you very much, Paresh Dave from Reuters, who covers Google and Alphabet as his principal, if not only, focus of journalistic investigation, for kindly agreeing to be our moderator. I thank you to Sachin, Anja, and Ken and David Hyman for your excellent presentations. I echo what Paresh said with a little bit more detail. If you're interested in viewing the recording of this, it will be posted on the McCarthy Institute webpage, also on our GGU Golden Gate University Presents YouTube channel, and on various social media pages of Keystone, which I think will include their Facebook page and others. And then, as he said, as Paresh said, slides can be obtained. And for any lawyers who watched, we are facilitating 1 hour of continuing legal education. And so please get in touch with Kelsey Anglin from One Source, who will facilitate the paperwork for you for that if you are interested. Otherwise, please have a happy holiday, and we will see you after the first of the year with episode 7. Bye-bye.